Aboriginal skeletons are there in the museum behind you?
Well, the Natural History Museum is one of the world's oldest and biggest and most respected museums, and in the building behind me, it's estimated there probably are around 170 remains of Aboriginals, been there for perhaps as many as 100 years. Of those 170, Aboriginal researchers know of at least 62, and they have names for at least 12 of them, and obviously they're very concerned that they want these remains back. Now, the reason why they're locked away in the vaults there, and by the way, you can't get to see them. We asked to actually film inside the museum yesterday. They wouldn't let us in. They won't even let us be in there this morning. It's a very sensitive issue. They're not on public display. You have to be a scientist. You have to have a good reason to go and search them out, gathering dust in the vaults. Now, just how they got there is open to question this morning. There have been reports, and some Aboriginals believe that some of them were shot to order by scientists at the turn of the century. Others were murdered. Other bodies were taken from massacre sites. Some were taken from funeral parlours. Some were taken from ancestral burial grounds and brought here to Britain to be studied by scientists. And of course, they were very keen on studying the Aborigines at the turn of the century because they thought they were the missing link, the Darwinian theory of evolution. They were the missing link between ape and man, and they thought the Aborigines could hold the key to it. And it's not just here at the Natural History Museum where there are 170 of them. Around Britain at one point there were some 3,000 remains of Aborigines. That has since been whittled down because the Aborigines have been successful in getting some back. Edinburgh University, for instance, has actually sent back several hundred remains to Australia. There are now about 1,500 Aborigine remains still in the possession of British museums and universities. Now, we did ask the Natural History Museum for a statement, and they said that they can't hand anything back because they're governed by the British Museums Act, which means that it is their duty to conserve and protect whatever scientific remains they have. But also, reading between the lines, if you talk to other museums, basically no museums ever like giving anything back because that could start a bandwagon. Museums like to keep their exhibits, and the thought of one museum giving something back could mean that the others will have to give things back as well. And of course, there are big attractions here. But as I say, none of these Aboriginal remains are on public display.
Okay, Martin, we'll return to you in a minute. Awful, horrific story. With me is someone who knows only too well the agonies of coming from Aboriginal descent and the awful fate of these bodies. Is Lyndon Ormond Parker. He's an Aboriginal archaeologist. He's researched the history of the remains. Morning to you, Lyndon.
Morning, Fiona.
This must make your blood boil, being, as I say, of Aboriginal descent yourself.
Well, it does. It's rather upsetting that museums do hold Aboriginal remains, but my main purpose is to research and document and catalogue museum collections in this country. And the Natural History Museum has actually refused access to not only myself, but other postgraduate and PhD researchers in this country. And also, the World Archaeological Congress was denied access to records relating to the museum's collection.
Why do you think they're doing this? Do you think it is because some of these bodies, these skeletons now, were shot to order?
Well, there's no conclusive evidence that they were actually shot to order, but we do have evidence that of Aboriginal people that were murdered and killed, which have now ended up in the Natural History Museum.
There was an export trade, though, wasn't there? An export deal for Aboriginal bodies to be brought into this country for anthropological study. I mean, that's been going on
Absolutely.
Since the early, what, the 1700s or something?
Yes, the late 1700s, and right up until evidence in 1930s that Aboriginal remains were sent to this country and to other countries overseas. And it's not only Aboriginal remains, it's remains of Indigenous people from all over the world have ended up in this country. And now researchers like myself are looking at documenting and cataloguing those collections and looking into the history of it as well.
And of course there are relatives out there, aren't there? Relatives back in Australia who must be totally bereft knowing that their relation is lying locked up in a museum somewhere.
Absolutely. There are often, within collections, there are individuals with known descendants and relatives living today, even grandchildren of particular individuals.
Do you know of grandchildren in Australia?
There are some, yes, which have made claims for remains in this country.
The Aborigines have always had such a raw deal, haven't they? I mean, can you outline perhaps what it is like?
Well, basically, it wasn't until 1967 that Aboriginal people in Australia actually got the vote and were classed as citizens. And that's a very short time ago. And it's only in the last few years which museums have actually allowed researchers to go in and document and catalogue these sorts of collections. And it's only in recent times that museums have started handing back remains of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and as we say, about 170 skeletons lying there in the Natural History Museum, locked up, not doing anyone any good, really.
That's right.
We're going to return there now. Martin Frizzell is outside the Natural History Museum. Martin, you said that the museum had been saying that they're governed by the British Museums Act, but cannot the government step in to do something about this?
Well, this is just it. The government has said, as far as they're concerned, they haven't heard from anyone like Lyndon, and I understand what Lyndon is actually doing now is he's researching all this, and he will present a list to the Australian government. His work is funded by the Australian government. He'll present a list of just how many remains he believes there are, and then the Australian government may well ask the British government for a repatriation. What the Natural History Museum says is that we're bound by government law. We can't do anything. It's down to the government to do it. Well, we spoke to the National Department of Heritage yesterday. They said there has been no representation from anyone, either from archaeologists or from the Australian government. If a representation was made, our response, the government response, would be that it's a matter between the Aborigines and the Natural History Museum. So it will, at the end of the day, fall upon the museum curators here to give, if they want, those skeletons back. But at the end of the day, as I say, it's up to them, and for the time being, they say they remain locked up in their vaults.
OK, Martin Frizzell, we have to remember, Lyndon, that we're not just talking about skeletons, we're talking about people, as we said, with relations still alive in Australia.
That's correct. And it's up to the museum board of trustees that can make these sorts of decisions, and they should be looking at themselves now as an academic institution and allow access to researchers.
OK, Lyndon Allman-Parker, thanks very much for coming in this morning. Thank you.
Across the country, you're waking up to GMTV on this Tuesday.